Our second story from the War of 1812, Mr. Madison's controversial war, is the story of Fort Dearborn. Fort Dearborn is today's Chicago. Originally, this was just a settlement of a few American settlers, a few American military people, a lot of the Potawatomi Indian tribe, and they're located in kind of a swampy, marshy area of what is now the area of Chicago. There's a picture of what we think Fort Dearborn might have looked like. We don't know that for sure because the fort was eventually destroyed, but you can see it's right on the shores of Lake Michigan. In downtown Chicago today, they have markings on the sidewalk where they believe Fort Dearborn was. Here's a picture of modern day Chicago. Boy, have we changed a lot from Fort Dearborn to Chicago. These two tall buildings on the right are the Marina City buildings. There are apartments in the top of the building. There's parking garage in the bottom. The river running through here is the Chicago River that flows, well, it used to anyway, flow out into Lake Michigan. At one point, they turned the river around and found ways to make it run backwards, so all the sewage and everything else that got in the river would not go out into Lake Michigan, but it goes backwards through the state of Illinois out to the Mississippi River. The river might look green. It's not because there's something wrong with it, because this is a picture taken at St. Patrick's Day, where they dye the river green for part of the day as the St. Patrick's Day celebration. A lot of the famous downtown section of Chicago is here. My dear old dad grew up here in the Garfield Park section of the city. There it is. There's his house right in the center. Today, it's still a nice neighborhood way out on the west side of Chicago. There's even a kind of a famous story. If you want to, you can Google this and watch Nick Wallenda, a famous tightrope walker, walking a tightrope between the Marina City buildings and the Leo Burnett building in November 2014. There he is walking. Discovery Channel paid for it. So Chicago, of course, still a big deal, still a famous place. The people behind are in the Marina City buildings, the apartments, watching Nick Wallenda with his blindfold on, a very windy day, tightroping across the Chicago River. The story of Fort Dearborn in the War of 1812 is another just weird, bad story of the United States Army making all kinds of mistakes and looking really, really bad. So this is Captain Nathan Heald, and he is shown in this monument just outside the Marina City buildings, with American settlers, and he's kind of greeting them, shaking their hands. The Army is there to protect them. Well, Captain Heald in Chicago has been given orders during the early part of the War of 1812 to go to a different fort called Fort Wayne that's now in Indiana. So Captain Heald and his soldiers left the fort with the civilians staying behind. Those civilians who were still there are massacred by the Potawatomi Indian tribe. When Captain Heald returned to Chicago, he had found there was no problem that he needed to deal with at Fort Wayne, and in his absence from Fort Dearborn, every American had been killed. So it's a really embarrassing story. There's a picture this is on a building, an engraving on a building in Chicago of a fight with the Indians. On the sidewalk, you can see in a couple of places the site where Fort Dearborn probably was. There's a picture of Fort Dearborn, maybe looking across what is now Lake Michigan. At the time, it had certainly not been anything like today's modern city of Chicago. Another view of what Fort Dearborn may have looked like. Fort Wayne is where Captain Heald and his soldiers traveled to, thinking there was a problem there in northern Indiana, but there wasn't. When they returned to Fort Dearborn, all the Americans had been killed. Here's a picture of the modern day skyline. This is commonly known as the Sears Tower, was for a long time the tallest building in the United States. Now it's known as the Willis Tower because a different company owns it. Sears does not own the building anymore. Lots of offices and things, and you can go up to the top of the building and see the sights. That ends our story of Chicago and Fort Dearborn. A bad, bad story for the American Army, an embarrassing way to lose a battle.